So welcome again. I'm Professor Susan Holman, and today's topic is religion and mental health, learning from Christian late antiquity, with our guest speaker, Dr. Brenda Llewellyn-Eason. Dr. Llewellyn-Eason is Associate Professor of Medieval and Early Christian History at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington. She did her undergraduate studies in education and English at Concordia in Portland, and she has a master's degree from Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary at Berkeley, and she did her doctoral work at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, Canada. She's the author of 2 books on religion in late antiquity, including one on money lending in the early Christian era. She's also taught in Wales, and I first met her, I think, at a symposium in Belgium. Her good energy, her humor, her creativity continue to inspire me as much as her scholarship. And so I think you'll enjoy today's session. I'm going to unshare and welcome Dr. Llewellyn-Eason.
Thank you. I am going to share my lecture and we'll get that started. All right, thank you so much for the invitation to talk with your class, and welcome to both of the classes. When your professor asked me, I think in the summer, to if I would be interested in speaking at the class, since we both teach courses that are similar, I said, sure, of course. Why wouldn't I want to? What a great thing. And she offered me choices on the topics. And I chose this one, and it's the hardest. And that's actually why I chose it, because I've been teaching this course for a couple of years, and I haven't felt like I've really been able to wrap my arms around the topic of religion and mental health. I don't think I've yet got them around it. And maybe that's the point, right? I mean, Origen said, if there are contradictions, we have to ask why that is. And so what I'm going to do today is take you into this complicated subject. And then at the end of the class, we're going to try to figure out what we've learned. And I always learn something going through it. So I don't know what I'm going to learn by the end of it. So I'm excited to find out. So mental health is a modern term, right? Like psychiatry, right? It's a modern term that we put back on ancient texts, and it doesn't always fit. A lot of the history of mental health is really shrouded. We often can't find it, except when we have written evidence about human behavior. And when we see human behavior in these texts, we have to ask ourselves questions about why that's being addressed and why that's worth noticing. What's really clear in this very complicated history or shrouded history of mental health is that there are most often 2 responses towards people who demonstrate behavior that deviates from some expected norm, whatever that cultural norm might be. One response is that the different are honored as demonstrating a unique relationship with the divine, and therefore they're special, or they're criminalized and persecuted for demonstrating the very same behavior because they are thought of having a unique relationship with the demonic. So the same behavior might elicit one of those very different responses, which really sort of complicates our understanding of mental health and what is meant by that term. Early attitudes are pretty clear that the interior is in the grip of something exterior to the interior. And the exterior might also be in the interior, which makes it even more complicated. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you an outline. And I sent an outline, I believe, to your professor. And so if you have that and you're a note taker, then you've got that. But if not, right, here it is. I'm going to talk about some challenges in looking at the texts from your period under study. So we've got ancient etiology, terminology, culture and nature, and sort of blurring views of the ill. And then I want to talk about some dichotomies and themes, because this is when I first started teaching this theme within my class, this is what I encountered, is there's these divergent ways of viewing the exact same thing. And so this is worth, these dualities are worth thinking about. We'll talk about the mind and the soul and the body. We'll talk about cause. We'll talk about control, treatment, scientific leaps. From there, we'll go and spend a little time with the texts, Stephanus, Paul, and John Chrysostom, and I will invite Dr. Holman's students to summarize for Dr. Wong's students the texts that they were not assigned. So be ready for that. And then some conclusions, and I'm looking forward to hearing what your conclusions are. And I see there's already things in the chat. So is that from, that's not for me, right? No, okay. All right then. So let's get started. Okay. So, oh, there we go. All right. So the relationship between the mind and the body can't be adequately addressed in a single lecture. So I've broken it up this way, and we're going to start with these challenges. So ancient etiology is, for the most part, more comfortable with the concept of disease rather than disorder. And the distinction between the two is that a disease is a distinctive process in the body with a specific cause and specific characteristics. Alternatively, a disorder tends to be an irregularity or a disturbance, and the assumption is that there are normal functions, and the disorder is a deviation from the normal functions. In addition, in terms of terminology, there are a lot of different words for things that we categorize as mental health, right? We have the term mental health, but that's not, again, a term that's being used in these texts. So some of the terms that we see are melancholy and mania, with mania often being understood as sort of melancholy plus, right? Even though these are, as we understand them, kind of two distinct things, but they're often used slightly interchangeably. There's also phrenitis, which is inflammation of the brain, a term that's used often, and lethargos, inactivity due to forgetting. And of course, we can see, lethargy or lethargic in that word. And then there's a whole list of other words that emerge that you probably saw in your readings for today. There's sorrow. I was so amused to read the word shagginess in one of the texts for today. It just really, it amused me. Despondency and sloth and gloom and brooding and grief and being cast down and lamenting and anxious. And at least half of those were present in the readings that we have for today. And there's no doubt that all of these mean different things, right, in these texts, but we don't necessarily know how the authors themselves are using these terms, right? So that can be a real challenge. In terms of culture and nature, there really isn't any universality in the study of mental health, but mental health is not simply a social construct, okay? That said, social conditions do impact how mental health is understood, or mental behaviors, or mental diseases, or mental disorders. And then when you add into the mix religion, it gets all the more complicated, because sometimes behaviors that people who are mentally ill engage in are also behaviors that in a religious context are perfectly acceptable and normal. And so I want to give you two examples. One example is the idea of religious ecstasy, where a person is so caught up in a mystical moment or prayer, right? Or communication with the divine, that they might engage in behaviors that would seem odd to someone who is on the outside of that experience or that community. A simpler example might be Hildegard of Bingen, who had what what medical doctors would call migraine headaches. And migraine headaches, for those of you who have experienced migraine headaches, know that there are certain biological things that go on. So there's problems with vision. There is, problems with, sound impacting the levels of pain that a person with a migraine can experience. People who experience migraines can have trouble with sight, right, with vision. And so if you know someone who's experienced a migraine, you know that if it's very bad, they can just physically shut down, right? And Hildegard had what appears to have been really bad migraines. And as a result of those migraines, she experienced visions, right? So one could say, oh, well, that's just a migraine, right? That's just a biological activity. On the other hand, it might be identified as a form of a religious experience, which would be completely normal in her context. And knowing Hildegard, if you said she was having a migraine, she'd probably say, yes, and I'm also having a religious experience. What's your problem, right? But then there's also the blurring of sort of clinical and moral views of the ill, okay? So why would that be the case? Why would that be the case that the medical marketplace might blur these categories? And the reason is because healthcare didn't take place in just one environment, right? So the go-to for healthcare, and it's funny because I never think to include this category in this little Venn diagram, is the first go-to in healthcare is yourself, right? Like if I hurt myself, I don't immediately go to someone else. I immediately assess my own medical situation, right? In the time period in which you're studying, in addition to the self, most often an individual would consult members of their family to determine if that was something that could happen within the family, or if permission could be granted to seek medical attention outside of the family. And outside of the family, a person had a couple of different options. There are, of course, physicians, there are folk healers, and there are divinities located in healing shrines or temples. And this medical marketplace was competitive, but it was also inclusive, and it was freely understood that you would partake of whichever of these you would need, sometimes simultaneously, right? But the problem is that the diagnosis and care that's offered by a physician might differ from the diagnosis and care offered at a shrine, which is different from the diagnosis and care offered by a folk healer, right? So any one of these categories might say, well, your problem is because you've sinned, right? Or your problem is because you've committed some, well, not a crime, but maybe you've done something wrong. You've failed to honor something you're supposed to honor, or you failed to do something correctly. So it doesn't have to be sin, right? And as a result, you're suffering for it. Or your humors might be out of balance, or you ate some bad meat, right? So there are a variety of diagnoses. It could be because you're a bad person, or it could be because you ate bad meat, right? And so these are conflicting and sometimes simultaneous, right? So then additionally, there are blurring of views of the ill because of hierarchy of cause, right? And irrespective of the religion, whether it's Zoroastrianism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, or any kind of indigenous religion, there's always a hierarchy of cause when there's any kind of disease or disorder, all right? There is, on one hand, the divine figure who may or may not be interested in the moral behavior of an individual and punish them accordingly, or not care, right? But then there's also natural causes, right? So climate, or food, or education, or again, behaviors in which someone engages that might bring about, or bad air, right? That might bring about a disease or a disorder. So when Christianity comes along and becomes, a prominent and in time sort of stable religion that is part of the religious landscape, deviance is equated with evil forces and manifested itself in wrong thinking or in ill health, right? So this becomes kind of a normal part of a normal piece of Christian attitudes towards those who are ill. But the thought world of Christianity from, early on to from, first century to the 21st century is layered with spiritual significance. And the notion that the divine figure of God or of Jesus or Holy Spirit, if you want to pull in all parts of the Trinity, is part of that complicated cosmos was always present, right? And I highlight this image here. I know that image is a big part of your study. And I chose this image specifically because notice that this figure here of Jesus has a compass, right? So here you have this religious figure. So you have this spiritual layer, but you also have this scientific layer as well, right? So here's Jesus doing geometry, which I love, right? So in this image, you have absolutely no conflict between this notion of a spiritual world and a natural world, or a religious world and a scientific world. They're all functioning together, okay? So you've got this in addition to weather patterns and diet and the movement of the stars and the planets. And it's fair to say there's a lot of moving parts in thinking about what impacts people's behavior, okay? So at this point, I want to pause and see, are there any questions? You can put them in the chat if you want, or just unmute yourself, and I will do my best to translate your question. You're here, everyone's here, right? It's always these moments where I think, am I alone in the room? Good, all right, okay then. So here's the thing, in my classroom, if I don't have any questions, I assume pure and perfect knowledge. So Susan, you've brilliant students, pure and perfect knowledge. Okay, I will keep going then. And feel free to, shout out anytime if you have questions. So I want to talk about these key themes and dichotomies that emerge in the readings and really in this complicated history of mental health. So the first is this notion of dualism. And we don't want to think of the dualism of mind and soul and body as, to use the term again, as pure and perfect, right? Or a neat slice, okay? So a mental disorder suggests that the disorder or the disease is something distinct from the body, okay? That it's in the mind, but we can't really capture where and what exactly the mind is. A mind-body dualism doesn't suggest that the mind and the body are working against each other, but more that they're living things within living things, right? So this notion that you like in ancient gynecology, this notion of a wandering womb, right? The idea that a living thing, the womb, is functioning within the living thing that's the body. I think about this with respect to my own skeletal structure. Sometimes I think, is my skeleton me, or is my skeleton something that is like moving within me? I don't know. It's kind of a fun way of thinking about the skeletal structure. And it's October, so I'm going to think about skeletons a lot, right? So we see the texts that address this issue of mind-body dualism, again, aren't texts that are talking about minds working against bodies, right? It's a little bit more nuanced than that, right? So in Plato, for example, we have this text from Timaeus, and I think it's a great example of this. Plato writes, "No one wishes to be bad," very optimistic and surprising. "No one wishes to be bad, but a bad person is bad because of some flaw in their physical makeup and failure as education, neither of which they like or they choose," right? So here, Plato, whose notion of the soul, right, is located in 3 places in the body. So the reasonable component of the soul is in the brain or the mind. The emotional part of the soul is located in the heart, right? And the physical component of the soul is located in the belly, right? Or in that sort of the whole digestive system, right? So Plato's asserting that like there's something independent of the mind and the soul that supports whether or not the soul or the mind is healthy. And that could be, right, that could be a bad diet, it could be bad education, it could be a bad living location, it could be a bad home environment, right? Other examples of the mind-body dualism, again, not the mind against the body or the body against the mind, you can find in the Hippocratic Corpus. Persons ought to know that from the brain and from the brain only arise our pleasures, our joys, our laughter and jests, as well as our sorrows, pains, griefs, and tears. Through it, in particular, we think, see, hear, and distinguish the ugly from the beautiful, the bad from the good, the pleasant from the unpleasant. It is the same thing which makes us mad or delirious, inspires us with dread and fear, whether by night or by day, brings sleeplessness, inopportune mistakes, aimless anxieties, absent-mindedness, and acts that are contrary to habit. So that's a lot of pressure to place really on that component of one's existence, okay? Another example from a Christian text, I think you've probably read some Gregory of Nyssa. I can't remember from the syllabus. Are you reading Gregory in this class?
Yeah, but I'm not sure we've read anything yet.
Okay, you're not there. You're not there. Well, welcome to Gregory. Right? So, fourth century Cappadocian writer who in his text on the making of man writes, "For the mind is somehow naturally adapted to be in close relation with that which is in a natural condition, but to be alien from that which is removed from nature." And again, each organ of the human composition has its own special activity. Again, this notion of living things within living things. The power of the soul can remain effective if the origin in question is maintained in a natural and healthy condition. You're going to see much more intense mind-body dualism among different writers, but they're not necessarily writing about healthcare, right? And about mental health. So they're certainly there, but it's one that is, it's not a neat dualism, but nevertheless, it's worth paying attention to. A second dichotomy is a troubling one to work with, I think. I think this one makes me sad a lot of times when I read it, is about cause, right? This notion of whether one's mental health or mental challenges are a result of human cause or whether it's a malevolent force, right? And there's some texts that address this with great pathos, right? So many opinions about mental disturbances throughout history contain these sort of blends of evil spirits and human biology and behavior. So 3 examples that I want to highlight that you may be familiar with are the figure of Ajax, who throws himself on his sword, right, and kills himself either because he has an abundance of ego, right, and is embarrassed by his behavior, or because Athena has interfered with his thinking, right? Another example is Saul, a figure with whom some of you may be familiar with. He is either mentally disturbed because he has extreme amounts of jealousy, or because God chose to give him an evil spirit and remove a good spirit from him, which I would call malevolent, right? And then probably one of the most popular and well-known is the figure of Medea, who either kills her children in a fit of rage or with the assistance of Hecate, the goddess, right? So, I mean, you have either this human behavior, okay, or you have the existence and activity of a divine force that in all cases is clearly malevolent, right? And of course, as a result of sort of trying to figure out whether this is a human cause or a malevolent force, There are often biomedical perspectives that are sort of laden with judgment and stereotypes about people with disturbed behavior. So in the Hippocratic corpus, the authors tend to reject, for the most part, malevolent forces. And this made Hippocratic medicine really popular among Christian authors later in the period, actually, in which we're studying right now with these sort of early Byzantine authors and with John Chrysostom. So in probably the most well-known Hippocratic text, the author writes, I don't believe the sacred disease, referring here to epilepsy, is any more sacred than any other disease, but on the contrary, has specific characteristics and a definite cause. So a careful read of this passage suggests that the author is not wanting people to make an excuse, right, for poor medicine and saying, oh, well, this isn't something I can fix because it's just a bad spirit, it's a malevolent force. The author of this passage goes on later to say, if divine beings exist, they would impact the body for good, not for ill, right? So it's actually a very sort of pro-religion, pro-divine being approach, and sensitive to the human body, I think, as well, right? And we know, of course, that that for Hippocratic medicine, things like what we call mental health, right, that fall under sort of that category, like melancholy and mania, were a result of imbalances in the body, right? So an excess of black bile, right, can bring about melancholy, and an excess of yellow bile can push melancholy into mania, right? So this author would say, well, this isn't about demons. It isn't about divine figures being evil or cruel, right? It's about balancing the health of the body. A really sticky one is this next dichotomy, and that's control, right? So can people make their own choices is really what this issue of control is about. Are the fates of humans under their own control, or are the fates of humans under the control of other forces? And those other forces can be weather, those other forces can be laws, they can be planets, they can be deities, right? There's a lot of things under which other forces, there's a huge list. If human action is the product of human behavior, is the product of personal will, then blame is on the individual, right? This is your fault. You made this choice, this thing happened, it's very easy. If human action is determined by exterior forces, then there's little point in blaming an individual. And they're both, they're both operational still today. I mean, we do something simple, something goes wrong, and we wonder, what did I do, right? I had to have done something wrong to bring this about. So we see examples of the determinism versus free will theme in a couple of texts that I wanted to highlight here in Mark, Gospel according to Mark, chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. Jesus has stepped out of a boat, and immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. The man lived among the tombs. No one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart and the shackles he broke in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. It makes my heart ache to read this account of this poor individual who's engaged in self-harm. When the individual saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he, Jesus, had said to the man, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked, "What is your name?" And in what I think is probably one of the most chilling passages in all of Scripture, the man replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." This is a brilliant and chilling passage, I think, in Scripture, and a perfect example of determinism. This individual has no control over what's happening. And the art that is indicating this account is always so beautiful and so interesting. Here we have Jesus, here we have Jesus' followers. And I just noticed for the first time, this character is holding keys. This must be Peter here. Is that Peter? I never ever noticed that. I never ever have ever looked at that. I never looked past Jesus. But here on the other side, we have this individual. Notice he's being restrained. Here we have the sow into whom an evil spirit, even the legion, will be cast. And so you'll see this in religious art where you have like a small creature coming out of the mouth of an individual. It can mean a lot of different things, right? It can mean a lot of different things depending on which story it's meant to represent. But it's beautiful, and of course, the people who are looking at it are likely going to know the story. But here, this individual is not in control. Someone is speaking for him. He's harming himself, right? And so this would be a really good example of determinism. An example of free will you can find in the life of Saint Simeon, the Fool for Christ. And this is an interesting and unique theme in monastic literature, the subject of the Fool for Christ, and that's individuals who engage in behavior that is intentionally contradictory to social norms. And it is a way of drawing attention to a different message. But I argue here in this lecture that it is under the control of Simeon. As was said above, after spending 3 days in the holy places, Simeon, arrived in the city of Emesa. The manner of his entry into the city was as follows. When the famous Simeon found a dead dog on a dunghill outside the city, he loosened the rope belt he was wearing and tied it to the dog's foot. He dragged the dog as he ran and entered the gate where there was a children's school nearby. When the children saw him, they began to cry, "Hey, a crazy Abba," and they set about to run after him and box him on the ears. So I think it'd be interesting for someone to write a paper on the trauma, right, of the children seeing a man dragging a dead dog down the street. I just think, it just occurred to me now, I'm hoping someone will write a paper on that, because I think that's a really interesting idea. So you all have an assignment now. But of course, in the fools for Christ are not intended to be understood as foolish, right? But that word is used intentionally to indicate that there's something going on here that is in violation of social norms. And the language we're going to use about it is, this person is crazy. There are mental health things going on here, right? So the fourth of 5 themes is treatment, right? How are the mentally ill, or those who are suffering with mental health issues in these texts, treated? Is the treatment punitive, or is the treatment humane? We do know that neglect and harsh treatment have been so prevalent and so dehumanizing that they defy imagination, really. And a common way of dealing with people who exhibit behavior that deviates from whatever the culture's social norm is to erase them, right? So remove them from view. The problem is that the perceived weakness of someone merges with questions of control and responsibility. And so treatment is often a theme that emerges around the aging population in these texts, as it emerges in our own lives as we deal with aging population, right? At what point does a person's mental state mean that someone else needs to assume control, right? I've told my daughter, please, no matter what, just don't put me in a home. Chain me in the backyard. I don't care, right? I really don't care. Just don't put me in a home. She's promised. We joke about it. So, you know, the problem is, how do you address individuals whose behaviors might be cause to harm for other people or harm to themselves? And unfortunately, the solution is often place them someplace where they're controlled by others. And of course, that moves history into the era of institutionalism, which is hugely problematic. In late antiquity and the classical time period, you have two different ways. You have examples of both punitive and humane treatment of those who exhibit behavior that is distinct from others. Asclepiades in the 1st century recommended fasting and rest and music and massage and baths, or music twice, lots of music, purgation, exercise, narcotics, and trephining, right? So, you know, surgeries on the skull. And which sounds, you know, horrible, but the physical evidence that we have, right, suggests that people didn't just die from that, right? There's parts of the bone that show that, you know, there was healing that happened from that. Very humane. And I know that you just were talking about music therapy last week, right? So it's a reminder to you that there are very humane treatments for those who exhibited behavior distinct from others. On the other hand, Celsus gives us something else. Quote, those who are problematic in terms of what he believed was mental health problems were best treated by certain tortures, starvation, fetters, and flogging. So it's not the only thing he has to say about this, but I highlight it, right, to show you that there are two different ways of addressing issues of treatment. And I want to give you two modern examples, right, of how this continues to be prevalent in our society. And I've put links down here. So for those of you who have access later to the lecture, you can go to those links and see both of these articles. Here in 2016 is an article on how the Supreme Court ruling led to 70,000 forced sterilizations in the early 20th century. And I have, by comparison, the city of Halle in Belgium, which is as says in the headline there, a small town that has embraced strangers with mental illness. A common joke in Halle is that you can't tell the mentally ill from the residents of the town, and they refer to the mentally ill as their guests and their family. And there's a story there highlighted in that article about Luke, who lives with the woman there, Smith, and he lives there as a member of their family. It's really beautiful and really lovely and very inspiring, right? I mean, and there's parts of the United States where difference in behavior, whether it's a result of mental illness or not, are treated differently, right? There are families who will happily, plunk the person they refer to as their crazy aunt out on the porch with a nice pitcher of lemonade and a plastic cup, right? I mean, there are families where that is normal, and there are families where it's shameful, and you remove them, right? So punitive and humane, again, varies based on culture. So the last little dichotomy or theme that I want to talk about is, I had a hard time sort of explaining this one even to myself, but I think it's important to think about, and that is the difference in scientific and humanistic leaps or progress, however we want to define that. What I'm trying to work with here is that the scientific advancements happen fairly rapidly, and understanding human behavior and emotion seems to take a lot longer. And what to offer as an example, I offer Zoloft, right, which is a medical way of addressing certain mental health issues, depression, anxiety, PTSD. And within 2 months of a proper dose, a person can be living a very different life. That's a really short span of time, right? But what takes longer is understanding a human response to a person who's struggling with the kinds of crises that would require them to take that medication. So I think this dichotomy and theme, I haven't quite perfectly worked out what I mean by it, but that's really kind of the best I can do. And I'm happy to answer badly any questions that you may have about that. So before we talk about the text, I want to be mindful of the time. I have 10 minutes to the hour, and I understand, so we have 25 minutes left. Is that correct?
We actually have a half hour left. So
half an hour. Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to stop and see if there are any questions about any of these themes that I have worked my way through. Or if you have examples, if anybody else has examples of like, oh, here's something we've read that exemplifies this dichotomy that you're talking about.
I'll just say your example of, and the students can step in later after I stop talking. Your example of epilepsy reminded me that we had read Galen's letter to a father about how to care for his son who had a seizure disorder. And it was totally about,
Yeah,
you know, a humane nutrition and exercise.
yeah. Not tie him up and turn out the lights. Yeah.
To go along with that, I presented that topic to the class like after I read it, and it was a lot of like talking about the different treatment, and it really emphasized that like there's going to be days that are really hard and you're going to want to give up, but if you just follow this protocol and have the boy eat this way and do these certain things, like you'll be able to get through it, and it won't be terrible. That's the biggest picture I got out of all of it.
Yeah, and the thank you, Madeline. Thank you. The change in things like the diet, like that's a quick thing. It's like, oh, okay, I'll go get these things, but your ability to have patience with your child, that's harder, right? It's like that takes a longer amount of time, right? So yeah, so an encouraging letter. Luther wrote some really encouraging letters to people who were struggling with despondency and despair, even as he was struggling with those things, right? And this idea of having patience with your child and having patience with your neighbor is important. Yeah, good, thanks. Did someone put something in the chat? Oh, that's not for me. Okay. Yeah.
A question. You were talking earlier about the question of choice and whether people have control over the ability to conduct themselves, or whether there's other elements, whether spiritual ones or other things that determine them. One thing we talked about in my Theo 200 class was, sort of Christian understandings of the fall, and especially certain Western understandings of the fall, introducing a kind of corruption or limitation or vulnerability in human nature. How do some of the early Christians or other early people think about that in terms of control and how much agency people actually have left?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm trying to think, and Susan, I know you can help me on this. In terms of like medical texts, I'm trying to think about language about the fall in some of those texts. And I'm not sure in texts that are addressing medical care that I can think of examples of language about the fall off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm thinking we had one of our guest speakers was Maria Dorfler, who talked about children dying, and she's done a lot of work on scriptural texts on children's death and children's baptism. And she's very emphatic that many early Christians did not believe that children sinned. We're born in sin, this concept. Which goes against what we might think if we were raised on Augustine.
Right. Yeah. And what I can add to that is that Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity are going to be a little bit divergent on this. And the way that I often imperfectly explain this to my students is that for Augustine, people are born sinful into the world. And for Orthodoxy, people are born into a world in which sin exists. So the sin is unavoidable, but you're not born sinful. But Stephanie, your question has me thinking now about like specifically this issue of original sin and medical text and there or writings about medicine and health, right? Yeah, so I have to think more about that. And now I'm going to have to go read Augustine. Oh,
Well, we're going to be reading Gregory of Nyssa's Sermon on the Love of the Poor, where he talks about the people who have leprosy, and that,
yeah,
quote unquote, and it's not their fault.
yeah, yeah. And that makes me think, of course, of the passage in John where you have the man who is, I believe, blind, and the disciples say, who sinned, this man or his parents? And Jesus said, it's not about that. So yeah, so there's something fun to play with now. You've just given me more work.
The other thing that occurs to me, and you're really the expert on this, Brenda, is the idea of asceticism, because there's the concept of ascetics being able to improve their spiritual by what they do,
right?
Versus the Lutheran perspective that there's nothing you can do to get good enough.
Yeah, no, it's awful and very depressing for Lutherans. Why do good people suffer? Because there's no good people, Luther would say. Yeah. But yeah, and that gets you further into really that that gets you into a mind-body dichotomy that where it's a very clear cut, right? Which we don't see so much in these texts, where and monastic theology is going to have to work really hard to not be Gnostic in that way, and with a real hatred of the flesh. Okay. But now I'm starting to think about all these monastic texts where you have individuals embracing illness, and I'm wondering about language of the fall in them. And so now I'm going to have to make a note to myself to maybe think about that more. So yeah. Was there another question in the chat there?
I think Stephanie.
Question, actually. Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
I had a question. So my question is, like, in times when people were especially melancholy, they when people would commit suicide, would that be considered, or was that even written about? And if it was written about, was it an act of a demons overtook this person?
I had a hard time getting your question. So I think it's because of the connection, which is probably on my end. So was it Kayla that asked that question? Is that Kayla that I can see? Yeah, okay. So Kayla, I'm gonna, the part of your question I heard was about suicide. Is that right? And
yes.
Is suicide understood as sinful? Is that, or as, yeah, it's an important topic. I'm sorry?
Was it when it happened, was it written about as an act of demons possessing a person? Or was it more this person was so sickly, or I want to know more about what happened, or how was it explained?
Yeah. So the text that immediately comes to mind is one that I just taught last week, and it's the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas. And I will write the name of that in the text, in the chat. Easily gotten. And that is a martyr account. So the issue of suicide is complicated, surprise. to some degree, all martyr events could be argued as a form of suicide because an individual is making a decision, a rational decision, Rodney Stark would argue, for death because there are rewards as a result of making that decision. Because suicide often seems like to us to be irrational. And people say terrible things about people who commit suicide, that they're selfish, that they're lazy, never that they're brave, right? Never that they're brave. In the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas, Perpetua is in the arena. She's going to die. The gladiator is trembling, his hand's trembling. She takes his hand and takes his hand with the sword or knife to her throat, okay? And I've had students be incredibly upset about this, right? In this case, we're not talking about, someone who is despondent, right? But someone who, at least according to the text, is facing their death with a certain degree of bravery or even futility. It's futile to protest at this point. They're written about as heroes, right? So why does that change? Okay, the Maccabean martyrs are heroes. Okay, the Jews who killed themselves in the Josephus text when the Romans are going to overtake them, they're written about as heroes, right? Jesus makes a decision to agree to the circumstances of an arrest and death, right? And he's considered a Messiah. So why, right? I'm struggling to think about texts from my time period that address somebody specifically killing themselves. Susan, are you?
Yeah, Augustine talks about the women who are raped during the invasion of Rome.
Yeah.
And I just posted in the chat, it's a PDF that I scanned that has a wide variety of primary sources in English translation about ancient responses to suicide. Some of them are philosophical, so they're not Christian, and it has the Augustine text as well.
Yeah, great.
But in general, Christians did not approve of suicide. But then there were these conversations about, if there's other stressors, we need to be mindful of those.
Yeah. So, and what it seems to me is that there are suicides that are acceptable and suicides that are not, right? And so I think this is, sorry.
I was just going to say that makes us uncomfortable, but it's true.
Right. Right. And I think it's important to keep in mind in modern conversation because people are killing themselves. And a lot of people are struggling with mental health. And a lot of people who, such as individuals your age, are struggling with mental health because you've just spent a year and a half isolated. And that takes a toll, right? And so I think that the conversation about suicide versus martyrdom amongst Christian communities, I think is an absolutely essential one right now. Because I don't think it's just or helpful or healthy to view some individuals who have killed themselves or willingly gone to their death as heroic and others as problematic. So, but I will send to your professor a PDF of a text that I assigned by Rodney Stark on martyrdom as rational choice. And I'm not talented enough to be able to put it in the chat right now, because what will happen is I'll get distracted and something will go wrong and we'll waste time, but I will send it to her and you can follow up. It's a great article. It's a great article. So yeah, short answer, right? Short answer.
Actually, one more input here. It reminds me of the story of Origen. The early Christian author Origen, his father was martyred, and Origen was very zealous about martyrdom and he thought it was a great thing. So he wanted to go running out the door to get martyred himself, but his mother hid his clothing so he could
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. A real martyr would have run naked out into the streets. Right. So it's like he obviously did not want it enough. Right. And yeah, and that reminds me that, you know, in writing about martyrdom, there's a lot of no, you shouldn't be running out into the street. You shouldn't be running towards death.
Right.
Right. So this will actually be so this is a really good example, Kayla, about what scholarship looks like, right? We start with, okay, here's this one thought. And then in conversation, we start remembering all these other things and thinking about it. Yeah. And Christians or theologians are going to write, no, this is how your response to martyrdom is what it's supposed to look like. And we have to remember also that there were a lot of Christians who didn't see any problem with denying, right, who they were, because they had, you know, children, jobs, obligations, and that had to be addressed. So, but before we go too far down the rabbit hole of that, I should probably pull myself back. Oh yes, isolation is inextricably linked to suicide, says a psych major. Exactly, right? And in many ways, this kind of that comment, whoever made that comment, leads us right to the John Chrysostom text, because I think that one of the things I was really excited about this text is his isolation and how his isolation and her isolation are contributing to their mental health. Okay, so Susan, would you prefer we go right to the John Chrysostom? That is the worst name for someone with a lisp, I just gotta say. Should we go right to John's letters?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so let's do it. Let's do it. So we're gonna go past Stephanus and Paul. Okay, all right, so would someone in Professor Holman's class like to summarize the letters? What are these texts that she asked you to read? Would someone be willing to say, what did she ask you to read? Because there's other students here who haven't read these. They don't know what they are. Would someone be willing to do that?
I'm sure there's someone who would be willing, because I know there are several of you that tend to do 150% of the homework.
Yeah, so
Maybe while they're collecting their notes, do you want to give a brief summary of who John and Olympias are?
sure. Yeah.
I did that very briefly, but we really haven't talked about them in depth.
Sure, absolutely. So just really quickly, John Chrysostom, I've got his dates right there, 349 to 407 of the Common Era. He was the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was initially from Antioch, is that right? And was a bishop there as well. He was, I think it's fair to say, a fiery speaker. Chrysostom, meaning golden mouthed, he spoke beautifully, a rhetorician. And he didn't hesitate to call out people for problematic behavior. He historically has been accused of being anti-Semitic because he was really concerned about who was mixing with who in public squares. As the Patriarch of Constantinople, he preached a series of sermons that kind of called to account Empress Eudoxia, who took a personal affront at this. And so he was banished, and the people of Constantinople were quite outraged by this. He was brought back, but then he was banished again. And Olympia as well was a very strong supporter of his, and you might even call her a patron or a patroness of John, and a friend. She was his friend. And she was, I believe, widowed early and became a deaconess. So she achieved fairly significant status in her community, in the church. And I believe she was a deaconess at quite a young age too, which was fairly unique. But after he was banished, they wrote a series of letters to each other. Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have her letters. We just have his letters. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
Unfortunately.
yeah. And she herself was put on trial and then exiled. She exiled herself in 405. So I think it's important to remember and to keep that in mind. If you haven't read the letters and you're going to be reading them this week, keep that in mind, right? That it's not just that he's in exile, she's in exile. And I think that we tend to forget how much social isolation can contribute to mental health. And so again, whoever put that, the psych major who put that comment in there about isolation, that's absolutely true. And it's not just isolation like putting people in solitary confinement. Isolating people in a social setting can also impact their mental health, right? And this happens all the time in professional settings. This happens all the time in educational settings. I see it in my classroom, right? When you have individuals who just will slightly turn their desks so that others are excluded, right? I mean, it's insidious. And so being mindful of how we isolate people, even just within a room, right, is important to keep in mind. So who would now like to summarize what you read?
I read
Thanks,
letter
Melissa.
7.
Great.
And in that one, he basically was just talking to her about keeping the faith and to have faith in God. I do believe in this letter that he said that grief was a cure. In there, I can't remember at exactly what part, but if I'm not mistaken, there's that one. And then he also explained basically for how good comes out of the chaos. And that in order to grow stronger, you need to, kind of be dampered down in that the despair won't last forever. It's only for right now. He emphasized that point as well.
Good.
And yeah, and then he also says that his letters are the medicine, and if she's okay, to respond saying that she's okay. Yeah, that's basically.
Love that. His ego is just good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Grief as a cure, right? Grief as a cure. Would anyone else like to summarize the letter that they read and maybe address which of the approach John used? Madeline?
I summarized 12.
Great.
Or I read 12, and I was a little confused on part of it, but I got like the gist of it. So I got that this man was super sick. Like it just really went into detail how sick he was. He was almost dying.
Yeah.
And they gave great detail about that. And everyone was worried about his health. And then it goes into, it was him who was he proud of himself, or were others proud of him that he was like cured? And it just kept saying like over and over again that he was just praising himself or praising someone else. I was confused about that. But then it was saying that he was the biggest fighter that anybody knows. He did so great. He can conquer anything now. And it just kind of repeated that. But then at the end, it says, but you, a woman encompassed with a body. Then it talks about a woman. So I was a little confused there. I didn't know if it was talking about a man or a woman the whole time. So got a little confused, but that's what I got. He was sick and he fought it. So he's the best.
It has such a great line in there. I spent the whole time nailed to my bed.
Yes.
I love that phrase. I'm going to use it for the rest of my life.
Yep.
This is another reason that I chose this topic when I'm given my choices, because I hadn't read these. And I was like, oh, I get to read something new. Nailed to my bed. It's fabulous, right? It's fabulous. And I think you did a really nice job of summarizing how these letters can be confusing sometimes. Why? because this is not our context, right? It's his context. And so it's like, if you don't have the story beforehand and the story after, if you don't know who's writing to who, it can be a little bit challenging and a little bit frustrating, right? But I think you got the gist of it, right? I think you got the gist of it. Do you think that in this case, sadness is the symptom or grief is the cure?
I think the grief is the cure. I
think you're right.
Yeah.
Good, good. So I have a few other questions that I composed, right? And I actually talked about this a little bit, and I think our psych major would say, no, this is the case. To what degree might the reality of social isolation contribute to either Olympia or John's melancholic circumstances? And, you know, we know it had to have to be taken away from your family, your home, that which is comfortable, that which you know, all of these isolating factors, even if it's by your own choice, right? This can contribute, you know, to one's mental health. And then I have two other questions that I put up here, an opinion question and a reflection question. What in John's letters surprised you about his approach? And what did that teach you about how you understand the history of religion and mental health? And how can religious stress complicate known similarities that exist between psychotic disorders, which can and do carry some of the same symptoms as religious experiences? If anyone would like to address one of those two questions, just pipe up.
I would. So I would not want John around if I was grieving, because I couldn't handle hearing, well, now you're healing. Well, now it's all right because it was God's plan and it's gonna work out, and you're gonna overcome any now that you've overcome this loss. Like that, I couldn't imagine someone saying that to try to console someone. Like, I think he lacks empathy to like understand, like, hey, this person's hurting. He's like, well, next day we have to move on. Like, you're ready for anything now. Like, I couldn't imagine grieving and having John around.
So I think what I heard you say, again, difficulty with the connection there, is you can't possibly imagine having this man try to console you. Did I get that correctly? All right, so I'm with you on that. But what if that's what she needed, right? So John and Olympia are friends, right? So is it possible that he's consoling her the way she needs to be consoled? Is that possible? Kyla, you're giving me the side eye. Like, oh. Sorry, that's my dog. No, it's not possible. John needs
I couldn't imagine consoling a friend like that.
Okay, but is it possible that their relationship works, right?
That's
Is it
wild.
possible? My question is it possible?
I guess.
Okay, there you go. See, to a certain degree, like we're on the outside, right? And we can't imagine.
Yeah.
What's important is, let's pretend, right, you and I are in a relationship. We're friends. What's important is that I know how to respond to you if you're melancholic, right? Not how John would respond to you, right? Because we're in relationship, we're in friendship.
Yeah.
So opening up your mind to the possibility that, like, this is one approach, and the fact that he changes his approach maybe means it didn't work, right? Because here's the thing, we don't have her response. Maybe she wrote, "Who do you think you are?"
Yeah.
She might have.
That's me.
Right. So maybe Olympia and Kyla are more alike than you know.
And Marissa has a comment in the chat essentially along this line. I was surprised how he used the "it could be worse" approach so often.
Yeah, I'm surprised how he used it. It could be worse.
I kind of understand where Kayla's coming from because I read letter 7 as well. And in the beginning, he definitely went on to ask like what upsets you, and he just like listed everything that was kind of going on wrong. So I kind of understand in that way is kind of like, but he tried to make it positive at the end, but he definitely did like list the things that were going wrong.
Mm-hmm. But and we do that though, don't we sometimes? Right?
Yeah.
Don't we do that? It's normal. It could be worse. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say under certain circumstances, right? Like we use it in incredibly inappropriate moments, right? Someone's lost their child. Oh, it could be worse because you have 2 more, right?
Hello, it is I, the psych major. I just want to rant about this real quick. So, it's actually a cognitive distortion called minimization, where you downplay the severity of an issue. And I really, really hate the phrase, it could be worse, because if you flip that and say, you're not allowed to be happy because other people are happier right now, you see the flaw in the logic.
Yeah.
That's all.
So Kara, what are you going to do with this as a psych major? Now that you've read this, what are you going to now do with it?
Well, I did really like the one point he brought up where he's like, it's okay to feel this grief. I forget what letter it was in. I read them all, kind of accidentally. But he talked about how like grief is useful and feeling sad about it can be helpful because you're processing those emotions. He says something like the tears can hold hope. I really liked that line.
Good. So you found something worthwhile in it.
Yeah.
Good.
We're coming up on time, so
okay.
I just wanted to make that observation.
So, okay, then why don't we do this?
But I think Elizabeth might want to say something. You appeared as if you were about to speak.
I was just going to say quickly that Brenda, when you were talking about using it in the context, when you look at the history of Olympia, and I don't even believe she was raised by her own family, she appears to have gone through a lot of grief in her life, losing a husband young, even with threats of losing all of her possessions by the people in charge because she wouldn't remarry the right person. It just, you look at all these details of things, and she even had hoped that everything would be taken away from her. And that's something that maybe fed her soul, knowing that's who she was. I do believe that in the right context, all these things kind of do take place, though we don't know her response. But you're right, kind of using that, hey, it could be worse, or hey, remember, it's not this anymore, kind of an attitude may have worked for her.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate what you're saying, because what I'm hearing you saying is that we need to trust that John understands his relationship with this person. And I think it's okay to do that. We don't know at the end of the day their relationship, and we don't really get to decide. And it's never the case that when people are engaged in a relationship and they know each other, that they just constantly hammer home the same idea, right? You take different approaches. And I'm going to trust that he knows what to say to her, and what he has to say to her isn't necessarily what a therapist is going to say to the person that they're treating, right, in the 21st century. And that's, I think, a key piece. So so thank you for that. So for concluding thoughts, I like to do this a lot, is I have a concluding thought, and then I want to hear yours. My one concluding thought is the study of religion and mental health, I can't see it all, is confusing and often contradictory. Proceed with caution. But what are your concluding thoughts, right? Who would like to offer a concluding thought, which I will type in here and we'll all get to see. What concluding thoughts do you have?
And I'll just say, for the students who are on, if you need to leave for something else, please feel free to do so. I will keep going until we're done, and I won't turn the stop recording on until we're all completely happy with being done. So this will be available for the last few minutes if you have to leave and want to find out what happened.
Yeah, and I won't take it personal. It was nice to meet you all. So would anyone like to offer a concluding thought? What have you learned?
I kind of learned that there's just so many different like thoughts about it and different sides to it that all come together, and you don't know which one to like go with. As in, like when we went through like all the different challenges, it was either this or this, they believed. So it kind of goes off of your thought that it's very confusing and there's opposing views to everything, and you don't know which one to go with a lot of the time. Which one's right, which one's wrong. If that makes sense. I kind of just rambled some words.
It does. It's okay. I'm gonna type, and I'm actually at a really odd angle, so I'm gonna type everything badly. But we'll do our best here. So, hey, anybody else?
I would say that rather surprisingly, people's struggle with mental illness hasn't changed very much. Like the letters between John and Olympia are essentially like a continuing friendship, reaching out to your friends for support and stuff. I thought that was interesting.
So people's struggles with mental health in late antique texts are mirrors of contemporary situations. Did I say type that?
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah,
Good.
great.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Because I think you're right. You know, I think you're right. Anyone else?
I was just going to say, when you were tying everything together, when you were putting the key themes together, and you talked about the control and the treatments, and it kind of brought me back to, we had read Horton and the Poverty, I think it's Charity and the invention of the hospital. We were talking about inventing like
Yeah.
hospital and what that looked like, and like I think about how you did the control and the treatment, and how at a point Christianity changed and wanted, because I know we do talk about the two sides of it being, whether it's, you know, the demons or whether it's your imbalances, but wanting to change it for them. Like it was really like all of these, the texts that I had read, it's that mental health needed to be addressed. You know, like we didn't know what to term it, but that it needed to be addressed, that these are real people needing help.
So however it was understood, mental health was acknowledged as real and something that needed to be addressed. Does that summarize what you said? Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
Okay, anybody else?
And I think just emphasizing Elizabeth's point, that's especially clear with the Paul of Egina and the Stephanas texts that we didn't discuss today.
So my dog is barking. It's either a squirrel or a bunny, and it's just all go. Okay, so again, so the need for legitimate and what's the word I mean the text that we didn't talk about today, which is so brilliant. I love how thoughtful the approaches were. Like hanging someone in a swinging basket, that's like my favorite. Right? I was like, oh, I want to go hang in a hammock. That's wonderful. And talk with your patients about arts, and talk with your patients about literature. I loved that. So the need for legitimate and humane treatment of people was, I don't want to say forefront, but was
Recognized.
was recognized. And it was clever, right? It was clever and thoughtful. Patient care was something that was taken seriously. Yeah.
So this is so rich. Thank you so very, very, very much. This is probably the most thought-provoking discussion, I think, on this topic that I've had in
Oh,
any
good.
of the classes where I've tried to talk about it. So I'm very grateful.
It's a rough one, you know, and that's, like I said, that was honest. That's why I picked it. I was like, oh, this is the one that I struggle with making sense of. And part of it really, and I want to wrestle with it more, is this issue of terminology. What are we calling people? You know, gloomy or shaggy or despondent or manic. Yeah, I'm excited to work with it more. Actually, I'll share with the few of you that are here. I actually got a grant last year called the Kelmer Rose Student Faculty Research Grant. And a student that I am working with, we're putting together a lesson for my course specifically on how women use religious ritual as a way of contributing to their own mental health that is impacted by gynecological problems. So we're using the life of Marjorie Kemp, or the book of Marjorie Kemp, as our primary text. And it's really exciting. And again, I was like, I need to think more about this. So yeah, it was fun. Thank you for staying a few minutes late and inviting me.
And I invite everybody to say formally thank you to Professor Llewellyn-Eason, and I'll stop the recording.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Thank you for your contribution.